Warzone Modern Warfare 3 update is beautiful, Urzikstan is beautiful, and hey, you know what? You're beautiful. And now let's make Warzone look even better with the best graphics settings for this season. And we start with on-demand texture streaming. As a rule of thumb, it sounds quite obvious. If you want the map to look better, switch this on. The downside to this, of course, is that it is going to take up a tiny bit of bandwidth and a tiny bit of processing. So there is a little bit of trade-off between making the game look a little bit better and having a little bit of worse performance, which is why many pros actually switch this off. So it is a subjective setting, but I like it on. For world motion blur, weapon motion blur, and film grain, as well as depth of field actually, I recommend switching these all off. So not only do they allow you to see much clearer when you're playing Warzone, but actually they can marginally improve the performance of your system as well. For Fidelity FX Cast, this sharpens the images slightly, so I do recommend switching this on. However, the strength is kind of difficult to recommend, as this depends on which console you're on, as well as which monitor you're using. So I did find with the Xbox Series X, going up to strength 100 actually works great for me. It takes out all of the blurriness and we just have sharp, crisp images, and I love it. So maybe you could try 100 out at first. If it's too much for you and maybe it's a little bit grainy, a little bit tarry, just turn it down. But you should know that switching this setting on and all the way up does reduce your frames per second just that little bit. And that's even more so the case if you are on the older generation consoles. So I really do recommend switching this way down if you're on those. For 120Hz refresh rates, if you do have the option, switch this on. This just allows us to have 120 frames per second. Of course, only newer generation consoles have that ability, and you need a monitor or TV that will allow that as well. For field of view, this is actually something I've changed quite a bit recently. I think when field of view was first introduced to consoles on Warzone, I got a bit too happy and I cranked it all the way up to 120. But obviously, Urzikstan is a huge map. So if we had our FOV on 120 here, some of the images and specifically the people in the distance are just too small to properly see. And again, if we do have our FOV too high, it ruins our frames per second even more. So I do recommend somewhere between 100 and 105. Below 100, I think you're not going to be able to see enough around you. For camera movements, we definitely want these on least, which is 50%. Then as we come down to brightness, I actually haven't altered it too much this year. I've got it on 55. So although Urzikstan does look and feel a little bit like Verdansk, it doesn't have as many of those dark corners that we were maybe used to back in the day, so we don't have to crank the brightness all the way up. 55 works well for me. Obviously, you could go even higher if needs be. For safe area, minimize this as much as possible. This just refers to where your HUD sits on the screen. And really the most important effect of this is that it brings that minimap slightly closer to the center. And by doing that, it minimizes the amount of time that we're tracking from the center of the screen to the minimap to see what's going on. Now, we're not quite done for graphics yet. We do need to go to interface and change a couple more things. For subtitles, I recommend leaving these on. Often the operators of your team and the opponent's team can shout some quite useful things. However, there's a chance that you might not hear with all the explosions going off, so it's nice to have that text on. Then one of the big changes that we can actually make as console players who don't have too many settings, Walter, in terms of graphics, is to go on the color customization and go down to color filter settings and specifically filter 2, and then put the intensity all the way up to 100. So this is going to be personal preference. Some people like those super vivid, realistic colors, but for me, filter 2 just makes the game pop that little bit more. So not only does it look better in my opinion, but it's actually easier to spot enemies. And then that's the final important graphic setting to change. But now that we're finished up here, I do recommend checking out these videos where I cover the best updated controller and audio settings for Modern Warfare 3's version of Warzone.